The blood-red sun cast long shadows across the parched earth as Lillian Miller stared at the empty chair where her husband once sat. 3 months a widow, the drought of 1871 had claimed not only her crops, but now threatened to take the small ranch her husband had built with his bare hands in the unforgiving Texas plains. She ran her fingers across the grain of the worn oak table where her family once shared meals and laughter, wondering how much longer she could hold on before the bank took everything. Lillian jumped at the sharp knock on her door. Standing on her porch was a man she'd never seen before, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that reflected the fading daylight. His clothes were trail-worn, a dusty hat clutched respectfully in his calloused hands. "Madam," he said, his voice deep but gentle, "name's Blake Hawkins. Your neighbor, old Jim Fletcher, said you might have work. I've been riding through looking for honest labor." Lillian studied him cautiously. His face was weathered from sun and wind, but there was something in his expression, a steadiness that made her pause before turning him away. "Mr. Hawkins, I appreciate your interest, but I'm afraid I can barely feed myself these days, let alone pay a hired hand." Blake nodded, his gaze sweeping over the neglected fields beyond her porch. "I understand, madam, but I see a place that needs tending, and I need somewhere to settle for a spell. I don't require wages, just a roof and meals while I help set things right." "Why would you do that?" Lillian asked, suspicion edging her voice. Blake shifted his weight, his gaze direct. "Because it's what decent folk do. Your land has potential, and you look like someone who's faced enough hardship." He gestured toward the empty fields. "I'll put bread on this table and love in this house," the cowboy told the lonely widow, the promise simple yet profound in the gathering twilight. Lillian felt something stir within her, not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile tendril of hope she'd felt since burying Thomas. "1 week," she said finally. "We'll see how it goes for 1 week." Blake nodded, a slight smile creasing the corners of his eyes. "That's all I ask, Mrs. Miller." She pointed toward the small structure beside the barn. "The bunkhouse is there. It's not much, but it's dry." "It'll do just fine, madam. I'll start with the south fence at first light." As Blake walked toward the bunkhouse, Lillian watched his retreating figure, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake or if the winds of fortune had finally shifted in her favor. Before dawn the next morning, Lillian woke to the unfamiliar sound of movement outside. Peering through her window, she saw Blake already at work, mending the broken fence posts by lantern light. The man worked with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years of hard labor and dedication. By midday, when Lillian brought him water, the fence line had transformed. "You've accomplished more in a morning than my last hired hand did in a week," she admitted. Blake accepted the water gratefully. "Your land deserved better than what it's gotten lately." He paused, then added carefully, "No disrespect intended." "None taken," Lillian replied. "Thomas took sick last fall. The doctor called it consumption. By spring planting, he couldn't leave his bed." She hadn't meant to share so much with this stranger, but something about Blake's steady presence invited confidence. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Miller." "Lillian," she corrected. "If you're staying, even for a week, Mrs. Miller feels too formal." "Lillian, then." Blake nodded, handing back the empty cup. "I'll finish this section before sundown." True to his word, Blake completed the south fence and began clearing irrigation channels before darkness fell. That evening, as they shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread at her kitchen table, Lillian studied him more carefully. "Where are you from, Mr. Hawkins?" "Blake," he countered with a small smile. "Montana originally. My father ran cattle there until the winter of '63 took most of our herd. After that, I've been working my way south, ranch to ranch." "What brings you to Texas?" Blake's eyes clouded briefly. "Thought it was time to put down roots somewhere warmer." He glanced around her modest kitchen. "Your place has good bones, needs work, but the foundation's solid." "Thomas had big dreams for this land," Lillian said softly. "Wanted to grow it into something we could pass down to children we never had." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "Dreams don't have to die with the dreamer, Lillian." The words lingered between them as they finished their meal in companionable silence. Days stretched into weeks as Blake's presence became a fixed part of Lillian's daily life. The 1-week trial period passed without mention from either of them. The ranch slowly transformed under his careful attention, fences mended, the barn roof repaired, and fields prepared for whatever the seasons might bring. With Blake's guidance, Lillian learned skills Thomas had always handled: how to mend harnesses, calculate feed requirements, and identify which cattle to cull when winter approached. Her hands grew calloused, but her spirit strengthened. "You're a quick study," Blake remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, the day's work complete. "Necessity," Lillian replied, but couldn't suppress a small smile of pride. "Though I have a good teacher." Blake's gaze lingered on her face a moment longer than usual. "Your husband was a fortunate man." The comment hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging the current that had begun to flow beneath their daily interactions. One morning in late August, Lillian woke to find Blake already gone from the bunkhouse. Unusual, as they typically shared coffee before beginning the day's work. Concern gnawed at her as she searched the barn and nearby fields. She found him kneeling beside a half-grown calf, its leg caught in a gopher hole. "Easy now," he murmured to the frightened animal as he carefully freed the limb and examined it for damage. Lillian watched silently, struck by the gentleness in his hands, the same hands that could drive fence posts with powerful swings now delicately probing the calf's injured leg. "Nothing broken," Blake announced, finally noticing her presence. "Just scared and a bit bruised." "Like most of us," Lillian said softly. Blake's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. He helped the calf to its feet, guiding it back toward its mother. "Blake," Lillian began, suddenly needing to give voice to thoughts that had been forming for weeks. "I can't continue letting you work without proper compensation. I've got a roof and 3 meals a day," he countered. "That's fair enough." "It's not," she insisted. "The ranch is producing again because of you. I'd like to offer you a quarter share of whatever we sell at market this fall." Blake studied her face. "Are you certain that's wise? People talk, Lillian." "A widow and a drifter working land together raises eyebrows." "Let them talk," she replied with more confidence than she felt. "This is business, and I'm making a business decision." His slow smile warmed something deep within her. "Then I accept your terms, partner." The September cattle auction exceeded Lillian's modest expectations. The small herd Thomas had left behind, now properly tended and supplemented with the few calves that had survived the drought, brought enough to pay off the most pressing debts and purchase supplies for winter. As they rode back to the ranch in the wagon, Lillian felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since before Thomas fell ill. "We did it," she said, the autumn sun warming her face. "You did it," Blake corrected. "This is your land, your vision. I'm just the hired help." "No," Lillian said firmly. "We're partners now. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Blake's expression softened as he looked at her, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time seeing not just a widow needing assistance, but a woman coming into her own strength. Together, then. That evening, as they counted out Blake's share of the auction proceeds at the kitchen table, their hands brushed. The contact, brief and accidental, sent an unexpected warmth through Lillian's body. She withdrew quickly, confusion and guilt washing over her. "I should turn in," she said abruptly, rising from the table. "Tomorrow's an early start." Blake nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "Good night, Lillian." She paused at the doorway. "Blake, thank you for everything." His smile reached his eyes. "Sleep well." Alone in her bedroom, Lillian stared at the wedding band she still wore. Thomas had been gone nearly a year now. The grief had softened from a sharp, constant pain to a dull ache that sometimes faded into the background of her daily life. Was it disloyal to feel this new awareness of another man? To notice the way sunlight caught in Blake's hair, or how his rare smiles transformed his solemn face? The autumn days grew shorter as Lillian and Blake prepared the ranch for winter. They worked side by side, their movements falling into natural rhythm as they stored provisions, weatherproofed buildings, and ensured the livestock had adequate shelter. One evening, as the first cold front pushed through Texas, bringing icy rain that drummed against the roof, Blake arrived at the main house with an armful of firewood. Lillian opened the door, the warmth from her kitchen creating a barrier against the chill. "This should keep you warm tonight," he said, carrying the logs to her hearth. "There's stew," she offered. "Too cold to make the trip back to the bunkhouse until you've had something hot." Blake nodded gratefully, removing his damp coat. As he hung it near the fire, Lillian noticed a dark stain spreading on his shirt sleeve. "You're bleeding," she gasped, crossing to him quickly. Blake glanced down with mild surprise. "Must have caught it on a nail while repairing the barn door. It's nothing." "Sit," Lillian commanded, already gathering clean cloth and her small bottle of whiskey for disinfecting. Blake complied without argument, watching as she rolled up his sleeve to reveal a jagged cut along his forearm. "This needs tending," she said, her voice professional even as her heart quickened at the contact with his skin. She cleaned the wound carefully, aware of his steady gaze on her face. "You have healing hands," Blake observed softly. "I nursed Thomas for months," she replied, focusing on bandaging the cut. "You learn what needs doing." When she finished, her hands lingered on his arm longer than necessary. Blake covered her fingers with his free hand, the touch sending a jolt through her. "Lillian," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she hadn't heard before. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibility. Then the wind howled around the eaves, breaking the spell. Lillian withdrew her hands, stepping back. "The stew will be getting cold," she said, turning toward the stove. They ate in silence, the tension between them a living thing. When Blake finally rose to leave, despite Lillian's protests about the weather, he paused at the door. "I've been thinking," he said carefully. "Come spring, we should consider expanding the herd. The north pasture could support another 20 head if we improve the water access." "That would require more capital than we have," Lillian pointed out. "I've saved most of my share," Blake replied. "It would be my investment in our future in the ranch's future," he corrected quickly. "We can discuss it tomorrow," Lillian said, both relieved and disappointed by the shift to business matters. Blake nodded, settling his hat on his head. "Tomorrow, then. Good night, Lillian." As winter settled over the land, bringing shorter days and long, cold nights, Lillian found herself increasingly aware of Blake's absence in the evenings. Their days were filled with shared work and conversation, but nights stretched empty before her in the quiet house. One December morning, Blake didn't appear at his usual time for coffee. Concerned, Lillian wrapped herself in a heavy shawl and made her way through the fresh snow to the bunkhouse. Her knock went unanswered, and when she cautiously opened the door, she found Blake lying on his narrow bed, his face flushed with fever. "Blake," she called softly, approaching him with growing alarm, his eyes opened, glazed and unfocused. "Lillian, sorry, must have overslept." "You're ill," she said, placing a hand on his forehead and feeling the heat radiating from his skin. "How long have you been feeling unwell?" "Just since last night," he mumbled, attempting to rise and falling back as dizziness overcame him. Without hesitation, Lillian made her decision. "You can't stay out here. The bunkhouse is too drafty and you need proper care." She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they made their slow way through the snow to the main house. By the time she settled Blake in the spare bedroom, the room that had once been intended for the children, she and Thomas, never had his fever had climbed higher. Lillian worked tirelessly, applying cool compresses to his forehead and brewing the medicinal teas her mother had taught her to make. Through the day and into the night, she sat beside him, watching his chest rise and fall, fear clutching at her heart. She had already lost one man to illness. The thought of losing Blake was suddenly, frighteningly unbearable. "Don't you dare leave me too," she whispered in the darkness, her hand finding his. "Not when I'm just learning how to live again." Near dawn, Blake's fever broke. Lillian, dozing in the chair beside his bed, woke to find him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time in hours. "You should be sleeping in your own bed," he said, his voice weak but steady. Relief flooded through her. "And leave you to fend for yourself. What kind of partner would that make me?" A smile touched his lips. "A sensible one." "Well, I've never claimed to be sensible," she replied, checking his forehead. "Your fever's broken. Are you hungry?" "Starving," he admitted. While Blake recovered over the next few days, their relationship subtly shifted. The barriers Lillian had carefully maintained began to crumble as she tended to him in her home, sharing meals and quiet conversation during the long winter evenings. One night, as snow fell softly outside, Blake spoke of his family of parents long gone and a younger brother lost in the war between the states. Lillian, in turn, shared stories of her childhood in Virginia and the journey west with Thomas as newlyweds, full of dreams and plans. "Do you ever regret coming here?" Blake asked, watching her face in the firelight. Lillian considered the question seriously. "No," she finally answered. "Even with everything, the drought, losing Thomas, nearly losing the ranch, I don't regret it. This land has shaped me. I'm stronger for having fought to keep it." "You're the strongest person I've ever known," Blake said quietly. Something in his tone made her look up, meeting his gaze across the room. The admiration there and something deeper made her breath catch. "Only because I haven't had to face it alone," she replied softly. "Not since you arrived." The Christmas season arrived, bringing with it memories of happier times that Lillian had thought would bring pain. Instead, with Blake fully recovered and the ranch secure for winter, she found herself wanting to celebrate again. Together, they cut a small pine from the back woodlot and set it up in the parlor, decorating it with the few ornaments Lillian had brought from Virginia years before. Blake contributed hand-carved wooden stars he'd made in secret during his convalescence. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire sharing a special meal, Blake presented Lillian with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "You didn't need to get me anything," she protested. "Open it," he urged gently. Inside the package was a delicate silver hairpin with a small pearl set at its center. "It was my mother's," Blake explained. "The only thing of hers I kept." Lillian looked up at him, stunned by the significance of the gift. "Blake, I can't accept this." "It should go to your wife someday, or your daughter." Something flickered in his eyes. "I've never found a woman I wanted to give it to, until now." The air between them changed, charged with unspoken emotion. Lillian's hand closed around the hairpin, her heart racing. "Blake," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say. He shook his head gently. "You don't need to say anything. I just wanted you to have it, to know that you've come to mean." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That this place, this life we've built here together matters to me." Later that night, alone in her bedroom, Lillian stood before her mirror and placed the silver pin in her hair. The woman who looked back at her seemed different from the grief-stricken widow who had faced ruin less than a year ago. This woman had color in her cheeks and light in her eyes, and a future stretching before her that no longer seemed empty. As winter gave way to the first tentative signs of spring, Lillian and Blake began implementing their plans for expanding the ranch. The North Pasture development proceeded, with new fencing and a windmill to improve water access for the additional cattle they intended to purchase. Their partnership flourished in the lengthening days, each anticipating the other's needs and thoughts with growing ease. Yet beneath the comfortable routine, tension simmered, fleeting touches that lingered, glances that held too long, conversations that danced around the edges of deeper feelings. One mild March evening, as they reviewed their accounts at the kitchen table, the lamp between them casting a warm glow, Blake cleared his throat. "Lillian, there's something I need to discuss with you." She looked up from her ledger, noting the serious set of his face. "What is it?" Blake set down his pencil carefully. "I've had an offer. Jeb Morton over at the Triple M wants me to come work for him. Full foreman position, good wages." The words struck Lillian like a physical blow. "You're leaving?" she managed to ask, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "I haven't given him an answer," Blake said, watching her closely. "I wanted to talk to you first." "It sounds like a good opportunity," Lillian said stiffly, pride forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. "Better than a quarter share in a struggling ranch." "That's not why I'm considering it," Blake said, frustration edging his voice. "You know this place is turning around. By next year, it could be one of the most profitable operations in the county. Then why would you leave?" The question escaped before she could stop it, vulnerability evident in every word. Blake's expression softened. "Because staying is becoming complicated." "Complicated," Lillian repeated, the word heavy between them. People talk, Lillian. The longer I stay here, the more they speculate. I don't want my presence to damage your reputation. A flash of anger cut through her pain. So you'd rather abandon everything we've built together than face a few wagging tongues? That's not fair, Blake countered, rising from his chair to pace the small kitchen. I'm trying to do the honorable thing. Honorable? Lillian stood as well, facing him across the table. There's nothing honorable about walking away from a commitment. My commitment was to help you save this ranch, and I've done that, Blake said, his voice tight with restrained emotion. You don't need me anymore, Lillian. You can hire hands with the profits we're expecting. Is that what you think this is about? That I just needed someone to fix my fences and mind my cattle? Lillian demanded, tears threatening despite her best efforts. After everything we've shared, is that all you believe you are to me? Blake went still, his eyes searching her face. What am I to you, Lillian? He asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer Lillian wasn't sure she was brave enough to give. Months of suppressed feelings threatened to overflow as she looked at this man who had brought life back to her land and to her heart. She began, then faltered. You're not someone I want to lose, she finally managed, the admission falling far short of the truth burning in her chest. Something like disappointment flickered across Blake's features. I see, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Well, I haven't given Morton my answer yet. I told him I'd let him know by the end of the week. Lillian nodded, unable to trust her voice further. I should turn in, Blake said after a moment of heavy silence. Good night, Lillian. As he walked toward the door, Lillian remained frozen, words she couldn't bring herself to speak lodged in her throat. Only when the door closed behind him did she sink back into her chair, one hand covering her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. The next morning dawned clear and cool, spring asserting itself across the landscape. Lillian had barely slept, her mind churning with thoughts of Blake, leaving of returning to the solitude she had known before his arrival. The prospect was unbearable in a way that surprised her with its intensity. She was feeding the chickens when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Sheriff Duncan riding toward the house. The lawman's expression was grim as he dismounted. Morning, Mrs. Miller, he said, removing his hat. Is your foreman around? Blake's checking the north pasture fencing, Lillian replied, anxiety prickling along her spine. Is something wrong, Sheriff? Duncan nodded, his weathered face troubled. Afraid so. Got word that Harvey Sloan is out of prison. His brother picked him up in Huntsville yesterday. Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. Harvey Sloan had been the leader of the gang that had robbed the Millersville Bank 2 years earlier. During the robbery, a teller had been killed, and Thomas had been among the townsmen who had helped capture Sloan after a lengthy chase. Why would you need to tell Blake about Harvey Sloan? Lillian asked, though a terrible suspicion was already forming. Because your Blake Hawkins testified at Sloan's trial, Duncan said gravely. He was working as a deputy in Caldwell County then. Sloan swore he'd get even with everyone responsible for sending him away. Lillian stared at the sheriff, pieces falling into place. Blake had never mentioned being a lawman, but then, there was much about his past that remained unspoken between them. How dangerous is this man? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Dangerous enough that I'm warning everyone who was involved with his capture and conviction, Duncan replied. Sloan's not one to let go of a grudge, and his brother Roy is just as mean. Thank you for the warning, Lillian said. I'll tell Blake as soon as he returns. After the sheriff departed, Lillian paced the porch, watching for Blake's return with growing anxiety. When he finally appeared on horseback, riding in from the north fields, relief washed through her. Blake, she called, hurrying down the steps to meet him as he dismounted. He looked at her sharply, clearly reading the concern in her expression. What's happened? Sheriff Duncan was here, she explained quickly. Harvey Sloan has been released from prison. The sheriff says he's made threats against everyone involved in his arrest, including you. Blake's face hardened, a coldness entering his eyes that Lillian had never seen before. Duncan told you about my past, only that you testified against Sloan, that you were a deputy. Lillian studied his face. Why didn't you tell me? Blake sighed, leading his horse toward the barn. It wasn't a chapter I was proud of. I was a deputy for 3 years after the war, saw too much ugliness, too much death. After the Sloan case, I turned in my badge and started drifting. He glanced at her. When I came here, I was looking for something different. Something worth building, not destroying. And you found it, Lillian said softly, walking beside him. I did. His voice softened momentarily, then hardened again. But it seems the past isn't done with me yet. What will you do? Lillian asked, fear clutching at her heart. Sheriff Duncan seemed genuinely concerned. He should be. Harvey Sloan doesn't make idle threats. Blake unsaddled his horse with practiced movements. I'll ride into town tomorrow, see what Duncan knows about Sloan's whereabouts. And then Blake turned to her, his expression grave. Then I'll do whatever's necessary to ensure he doesn't bring trouble to your door. He hesitated, then added, This changes things, Lillian. If Sloan's looking for me, I can't stay here. I won't put you in danger. So you'll leave anyway, Lillian said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. First it was for my reputation, now it's for my safety. There's always a noble reason, isn't there? This isn't a game, Blake snapped, frustration breaking through his usual calm. Harvey Sloan is a killer. If he finds out I care about this place about you, he'll use that. I've seen what men like him do to get revenge. The words hung between them, Blake's inadvertent admission making Lillian's heart skip. You care about me? She asked quietly. Blake's expression softened, weariness replacing anger. You know I do, more than I should, probably. Then don't push me away, Lillian pleaded. Whatever comes, we face it together. Isn't that what we agreed? This is different, Blake insisted. This isn't a drought or a bank loan. This is a man who will kill without hesitation. And you think I haven't faced death before? Lillian challenged. I watched my husband waste away day by day. I've stared down the barrel of a foreclosure that would have left me homeless. I'm not some delicate flower who needs protecting, Blake Hawkins. Blake looked at her for a long moment, something like admiration kindling in his eyes despite his worry. No, he finally agreed, you certainly are not. The next morning, Blake rode to town to speak with Sheriff Duncan. Lillian spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation, jumping at every sound. By late afternoon, when Blake still hadn't returned, her worry had grown to full-blown fear. She was about to saddle her own horse and ride to town when she finally heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her as she ran onto the porch, only to freeze at the sight of Blake's grim expression as he dismounted. What is it? She asked, hurrying down the steps. What did the sheriff say? Sloan's been spotted in San Antonio, Blake replied, his voice tight. His brother's with him. Duncan thinks they're gathering information, figuring out where everyone involved in the case ended up. How long before they might come this way? Days, maybe a week. Blake led his horse toward the barn, Lillian following close behind. Duncan's sending telegrams to neighboring counties, letting them know to watch for the Sloans. But this is a big territory and laws spread thin. What's your plan? Lillian asked, determined to be part of whatever decision was made. Blake turned to her, his face softened by the fading daylight. I still think the safest option is for me to leave, draw them away from here, and go where, ride until they catch up to you. Lillian shook her head vehemently. That's not a plan, Blake, that's surrender. Then what would you suggest? He asked, a hint of challenge in his voice. Lillian squared her shoulders. We prepare, we don't run, and we don't hide. This is our home, and we defend it. Blake studied her face, something like pride mingling with the concern in his eyes. It won't be easy. And it will be dangerous. Nothing worth having comes easy, Lillian replied steadily. You taught me that. A ghost of a smile touched Blake's lips. So I did. Over the next days, they transformed the ranch into a defensible position. Blake taught Lillian to handle Thomas's old rifle, practicing until her aim was true and her hands steady. They stored extra water, boarded vulnerable windows, and established signals with their nearest neighbors for alerting each other to trouble. Through it all, their partnership deepened, the shared danger stripping away pretense. Each night, as they reviewed their preparations, the awareness between them grew more palpable, time potentially growing short, making honesty more urgent. On the fourth night, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Blake finally broke the silence that had settled between them. Lillian, he began, his voice low in the gathering dusk. If anything happens to me, don't, she interrupted fiercely. I don't want to hear what comes after those words. Blake turned to her, his expression somber. It needs saying, if something happens to me, the ranch is in good shape now. You can hire help, bring in the harvest we planned. Everything's documented in the ledgers. I don't care about the ledgers, Lillian said, her voice catching. I care about you. The admission hung in the air between them, too honest to be taken back. Blake reached across the space separating them, his hand finding hers. I care about you too, he said softly. More than I ever thought possible after all these years alone. Lillian's heart pounded as she met his gaze. Then why were you so ready to leave, to go work for the Triple M? Because I was afraid, Blake admitted, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Afraid of wanting something I didn't think I could have, afraid of dishonoring Thomas's memory, afraid you could never feel for me what I've come to feel for you. And what is that? Lillian asked, barely breathing. Blake's eyes never left hers. Love, Lillian, I love you. I think I have since that first day when you stood on this porch looking like you'd fight the whole world alone if you had to. The words she'd longed to hear washed over her, joy rising despite the danger surrounding them. I love you too, she whispered, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. I was so afraid to admit it, even to myself. Loving Thomas had always been easy, comfortable. Loving you felt like jumping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Blake's smile transformed his face, years falling away as he gently pulled her closer. May I kiss you, Lillian Miller? Her answer was to lean forward, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened with months of unspoken longing. Blake's arms encircled her, drawing her against his chest as the last light faded from the sky. When they finally parted, breathless and alive with new possibilities, Blake rested his forehead against hers. Whatever comes, he promised, we face it together. Together, Lillian agreed, her heart fuller than she had thought possible after such loss. They might have only minutes, hours, or years ahead of them, but in that moment, love seemed stronger than any threat that might come their way. 2 more days passed without sign of the Sloanes. Life on the ranch continued, cattle to tend, crops to plant, preparations to maintain, but now with a new current of joy running beneath the routine. Stolen kisses punctuated work breaks, lingering touches accompanied passing tools, and evenings stretched longer as they spoke of hopes and dreams that now seemed possible. On the 3rd morning, Blake rode out early to check the western boundary, promising to return by midday. When the sun reached its zenith with no sign of him, Lillian's earlier contentment gave way to growing unease. By mid-afternoon, her worry had become unbearable. Taking Thomas's rifle and loading her saddlebags with water and supplies, she mounted her mare and rode toward the western pasture where Blake had planned to work. She found his horse first, grazing peacefully near the boundary fence. Blake was nowhere in sight. Dismounting quickly, Lillian called his name, listening intently for any response. Only silence answered. Heart pounding, she followed the fence line, searching for signs of his presence. Near a stand of oak trees, she found scuff marks in the dirt, signs of a struggle. Worse, there were spots of what appeared to be dried blood on the grass. Lillian's blood ran cold. Forcing herself to think clearly through her rising panic, she examined the ground more carefully. Multiple boot prints showed at least 3 men had been present. A set of wagon tracks led away toward the south, away from town. The Sloanes had found Blake. For a moment, Lillian stood frozen, terror threatening to overwhelm her. Then determination took its place. Blake was alive, they would have no reason to take him otherwise. Which meant she had time to find him, to save him. But she couldn't do it alone. Remounting quickly, Lillian rode hard for town, pushing her mare to its limits. As she thundered into Millersville, people turned to stare at the sight of the widow Miller, rifle across her saddle, face set with grim purpose. She reined in sharply at the sheriff's office, dismounting before her horse had fully stopped. "Sheriff Duncan," she called, bursting through the door. The lawman looked up from his desk, startled. "Mrs. Miller, what's happened?" "They've taken Blake," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The Sloanes. There was a struggle at the western boundary, blood on the ground, wagon tracks heading south. Duncan was on his feet immediately. When? This morning, he left at dawn, said he'd be back by noon. Lillian gripped the edge of his desk. We have to find him, now. The sheriff nodded grimly. The Sloanes won't kill him right away. Harvey will want him to suffer first. Seeing Lillian's face blanch, he added quickly, that gives us time. Do you know the old Perkins place, about 15 miles south? Lillian nodded. The abandoned homestead near Crooked Creek. That would be my guess for where they've taken him. Isolated, plenty of cover. Duncan reached for his gun belt. I'll gather some men, we'll ride out within the hour. I'm coming with you, Lillian stated, her tone brooking no argument. Duncan frowned. Mrs. Miller, this is no place for a what, sheriff? Lillian interrupted, her voice steel. A woman, a widow. Blake Hawkins is the man I love, and I will not sit at home waiting to hear whether you found him alive or dead. Something in her expression must have convinced the lawman of her resolve. He sighed heavily. Can you handle that rifle? Better than you might think, Lillian replied grimly. Blake made sure of it. Duncan nodded slowly. Very well, but you'll follow my orders without question. These men are killers, Mrs. Miller. So am I if they've harmed him, Lillian said quietly, a coldness settling in her chest that she had never felt before. Within the hour, a posse of 6 men had assembled Sheriff Duncan, Lillian, and 4 townsmen who had known and respected Thomas Miller. As they rode south, Lillian prayed silently, bargaining with God for Blake's life with promises of anything he might ask in return. The sun was setting when they approached the old Perkins homestead, a ramshackle cabin half hidden among scrub oak and mesquite. Sheriff Duncan signaled for the group to dismount and approach on foot, using the growing darkness for cover. There's light inside, one of the men whispered, pointing to a faint glow visible through the cabin's single dirty window. Williams, Parker, circle around back, Duncan ordered quietly. Jenkins, Rogers, cover the sides. Mrs. Miller and I will approach from the front once everyone's in position. Lillian nodded, clutching her rifle with white-knuckled determination. As the men moved silently into position, Duncan turned to her. Stay behind me, he instructed. If shooting starts, find cover immediately. Understood? Yes, Lillian agreed, though in her heart she knew she would go through fire itself if it meant reaching Blake. They crept forward, using the deepening shadows for concealment. As they neared the cabin, voices became audible from within, harsh, angry words punctuated by a sound that made Lillian's blood freeze. The unmistakable thud of fists striking flesh, followed by a grunt of pain she recognized all too well. Blake was alive but suffering. Duncan held up a hand, signaling her to stop as they reached the edge of the small clearing surrounding the cabin. He waited, giving the others time to get into position, then nodded once. Harvey Sloane, he called out, his voice authoritative. This is Sheriff Duncan. You're surrounded. Come out with your hands up. Silence fell inside the cabin, then a harsh laugh sounded. Well now, Sheriff, wasn't expecting company so soon. The voice was rough, with a cruel edge that sent chills down Lillian's spine. Got myself a reunion going on in here. Don't think we're quite finished catching up. It's over, Harvey, Duncan replied steadily. You and Roy come out now and no one else needs to get hurt. That's so, Sloane called back. Thing is, I made a promise to Deputy Hawkins here, promised him I'd make him pay. Man's got to keep his word, don't you think? Lillian's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Blake was still alive, but for how much longer? Last chance, Sloane, Duncan warned. Come out now or we're coming in. A tense moment passed. Then the cabin door creaked open slowly. In the dim light, Lillian could make out a broad-shouldered figure, hands raised. Coming out, Sheriff, the man called. Don't shoot. Duncan kept his weapon trained on the doorway as the figure emerged fully into view. Roy Sloane, Harvey's younger brother. His face wore a sneer that didn't match his surrendering posture. Where's Harvey? Duncan demanded. Where's Hawkins? Roy shrugged, his hands still raised. Harvey's keeping your deputy company, said if anyone tries coming in, he'll put a bullet in Hawkins' head. Lillian bit back a gasp, fear clutching at her throat. A standoff was the worst possible scenario. What does he want? Duncan asked, his aim never wavering. Freedom, Roy replied simply. Safe passage south. You let us go, Hawkins stays alive, otherwise. He drew a finger across his throat in a slashing motion. Duncan's jaw tightened. I need proof Hawkins is still alive. Roy turned toward the cabin. Harvey, sheriff wants to know if the deputy's still breathing. Come see for yourself, little brother. Harvey called back, laughter in his voice. As Roy turned back toward the cabin, movement caught Lillian's eye, a shadow shifting at the window. In the dim light, she could just make out Harvey Sloane's profile as he peered out, using Blake as a shield. Without conscious thought, Lillian raised her rifle, sighting along the barrel as Blake had taught her. Everything narrowed to that moment, her steady breathing, the weight of the weapon in her hands, the silhouette framed in the dirty glass. She squeezed the trigger. The shot shattered the night. Glass exploded inward as Harvey Sloane stumbled backward with a cry of pain. Roy spun toward the sound, reaching for his hidden weapon only to fall as Duncan's shot took him in the shoulder. Now, Duncan shouted, and the posse converged on the cabin from all sides. Lillian was running before she realized she'd moved, heedless of danger, focused only on reaching Blake. She burst through the cabin door, rifle ready, to find Harvey Sloane on the floor clutching his bleeding arm, his gun just beyond his reach. And there was Blake tied to a chair, face bruised and bloodied but alive. His eyes widened at the sight of her. Lillian, he gasped, disbelief evident even through his pain. Sheriff Duncan was right behind her, kicking Sloane's weapon away and covering the wounded man with his pistol. Mrs. Miller, check on Hawkins, he ordered, though she was already moving to Blake's side. I'm here, she whispered, setting down her rifle to work at the ropes binding him. I'm here, my love. You shot him, Blake said wonderingly as his hands came free. You actually shot Harvey Sloane. In the arm, Lillian clarified, moving to untie his legs. I aimed for his shoulder, but the light was poor. A ghost of a smile touched Blake's battered face. Remind me never to make you angry. Once freed, Blake tried to stand but swayed dangerously. Lillian caught him, supporting his weight against her side. Easy, she murmured. You're safe now. As Duncan and the others secured the Sloane brothers, Lillian helped Blake outside to the fresh air. In the moonlight, she could see the full extent of his injuries, a split lip, bruised eye, and what appeared to be several cracked ribs, judging by the way he held himself. You came for me, Blake said softly as she helped him sit on a fallen log. You actually came. Of course I did, Lillian replied, gently touching his bruised cheek. Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you'd be smart enough to stay safe at home, he admitted. Thank God you weren't, Lillian smiled through the tears that threatened. I told you whatever comes, we face it together. Blake reached for her hand, wincing at the movement. Marry me, he said suddenly, his eyes intense despite his injuries. I know it's too soon and you're mourning for Thomas. Yes, Lillian interrupted, her heart soaring despite the night's dangers. Yes, I'll marry you, Blake Hawkins. His smile was brilliant even through his pain. I have nothing to offer but myself, he warned, and a promise I made months ago that I'd put bread on your table and love in your house. That's all I've ever needed, Lillian whispered, leaning forward to place the gentlest of kisses on his battered lips. That's all I'll ever need. The journey back to the ranch was slow, Blake riding double with Lillian, his arms wrapped around her waist for support. By the time they reached home, dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, bathing the land in golden light. As Lillian helped Blake into the house, their house now, truly she felt a profound sense of completion, as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. There would be healing ahead, both physical and emotional. There would be challenges and joys, sorrows and celebrations, but they would face them all together as they had promised. The Sloanes were headed for prison, this time with no chance of early release. Blake's former life as a lawman was firmly in the past. Before them stretched the future. They had built together a thriving ranch, a loving home, and the possibility of the family they both longed for. That evening, as Blake rested in what had once been the spare bedroom but would soon be their shared room, Lillian brought him supper on a tray. Setting it across his lap, she sat beside him on the edge of the bed. "I've been thinking," she said, watching as he ate with the appetite of a man returning to life. "We should set the wedding for June after spring planting. Give your ribs time to heal so you can dance with me properly." Blake smiled, the gesture still cautious with his split lip. "June sounds perfect." He set down his fork, taking her hand. "Lillian, about Thomas, what about him?" she asked gently. "I want you to know I respect what he meant to you, what he'll always mean to you," Blake said earnestly. "I'm not trying to replace him or erase those memories." Lillian squeezed his hand. "I know that, and Thomas would have liked you, I think. He always said a person's worth was measured by their actions, not their words." She smiled softly. "Your actions have spoken volumes, Blake Hawkins." "As have yours," he replied, his eyes warm with love. "Not many women would have tracked down a pair of killers to rescue a battered cowboy." "Not many cowboys are worth the trouble," Lillian teased, leaning forward to kiss him lightly. "You, however, most definitely are." As spring blossomed across the land, so too did their plans for the future. The ranch thrived under their joint care, the North Pasture expansion proceeding on schedule. News of their engagement spread through the community, met mostly with approval and a few raised eyebrows at the relative swiftness of their courtship. Lillian found she cared little for gossip. What mattered was the truth of what she and Blake had built together, not just a successful ranch, but a partnership founded on mutual respect, shared dreams, and deep love. On a perfect June morning, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and birdsong filling the air, Lillian Miller became Lillian Hawkins in a simple ceremony on their front porch. The same porch where Blake had first promised to put bread on her table and love in her house, a promise he had fulfilled beyond all expectation. Their neighbors gathered to witness the union, Sheriff Duncan standing as Blake's best man. Lillian wore a new blue dress, Thomas's mother's pearls, and the silver hairpin that had been Blake's mother's, honoring the past while embracing the future. As they spoke their vows, Blake's voice steady and sure, Lillian felt Thomas's memory blessing their union rather than shadowing it. Love, she had learned, was not a finite resource to be depleted, but an ever-expanding circle with room for both grief and joy, remembrance and renewal. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes," Blake vowed, his hands warm around hers. "To face each sunrise and sunset as your partner, your friend, and your husband. To put not just bread on our table and love in our house, but to fill our lives with purpose and our hearts with belonging." Lillian's answering vows came from the depths of her soul, a pledge to the man who had taught her that second chances could be even more precious than first loves. That night, as husband and wife, they stood on their porch watching stars appear in the velvet sky. Blake's arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Happy," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Completely," Lillian replied, leaning back against his solid strength, "though I was thinking." "A dangerous pastime," Blake teased. "What about?" "The house," Lillian said, turning in his arms to face him. "It's a good house, but I think it needs expanding, especially if we plan to fill it with children someday." Blake's smile was radiant in the moonlight. "Children, you want that?" "I do," Lillian confirmed, her heart full at the joy in his expression. "I always did with Thomas, but it never happened. I'd given up on that dream until you came along." Blake kissed her then, tenderly at first, then with growing passion. When they finally parted, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "We'll start on the addition next month," he promised. "A larger kitchen, another bedroom or 2 or 3, Lillian suggested with a smile. "I always wanted a large family." Blake laughed, the sound rich with happiness. "Whatever the lady of the house desires." As they stood entwined beneath the vast Texas sky, Lillian reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From grief to hope, from solitude to partnership, from cautious friendship to boundless love, each step had been necessary, each challenge overcome together. The ranch that had once been on the brink of ruin now flourished, much like her own heart. The future stretched before them, bright with promise and possibility. And at the center of it all stood the man who had kept his word in every way that mattered, the cowboy who had truly put bread on her table and love in her house. 5 years later, Lillian stood on the expanded porch of what was now known as the Double H Ranch, watching Blake teaching their 4-year-old son Benjamin to ride his first pony. Little Rebecca, just 2, clung to her mother's skirts, dark curls bouncing as she pointed excitedly at her brother. "Papa, Benny," she called, her childish voice carrying across the yard. Blake looked up, waving at his daughter before returning his attention to steadying the pony as Benjamin clutched the saddle horn with determined concentration. Lillian's hand rested on her swollen belly, where their third child grew stronger each day. The doctor believed it might be twins this time, a prospect that both thrilled and daunted her. Blake, of course, had simply grinned when she told him, declaring that they'd need to add another bedroom to the already expanded house. The ranch had prospered beyond their wildest expectations. What had once been a struggling homestead now encompassed over 500 acres, with a growing herd of cattle, productive fields, and a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far as Kansas City. More importantly, it had become a true home filled with laughter, occasional tears, and the kind of deep love that weathered all seasons. The promise Blake had made that first day had multiplied 100-fold, bread on their table becoming prosperity that allowed them to help neighbors in need, love in their house expanding to embrace children, friends, and community. As Benjamin completed his circle of the yard, Blake lifted him from the saddle with a proud whoop that made the boy giggle with delight. Together, father and son walked toward the porch, the small pony following dutifully behind. "Did you see Mama?" Benjamin called, his face alight with accomplishment. "I rode all by myself. I saw, my brave boy," Lillian replied, her heart full at the sight of her family. "You're a natural horseman, just like your father." Blake climbed the porch steps, setting Benjamin down to scoop Rebecca into his arms. The little girl squealed with delight as he swung her in a gentle circle before settling her on his hip. "And how are my girls today?" he asked, leaning in to kiss Lillian softly. "We're perfect," Lillian assured him, including both Rebecca and the unborn child in her answer. "Though your son or daughter is practicing for a rodeo today, I think." Blake placed his free hand on her belly, wonder crossing his face as he felt the strong kick against his palm. After all these years, such moments still filled him with awe. "Strong," he observed, pride evident in his voice. "Like their mother," Lillian smiled, covering his hand with her own. "And stubborn, like their father." As they stood together on the porch of the home, they had built both the physical structure and the family that filled it. Lillian reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the darkest days of widowhood to this abundance of joy, from a desperate bargain with a stranger to the deepest love she had ever known. "What are you thinking about?" Blake asked, noting her contemplative expression. "About promises kept," Lillian replied, leaning against his shoulder. "About second chances and new beginnings." Blake nodded, understanding in his eyes. They had built this life together, day by day, choice by choice, overcoming obstacles that would have defeated them had they stood alone. "I was thinking," Blake said as Benjamin began showing Rebecca how to pet the pony's nose properly, "we should add a proper rose garden on the south side, something beautiful just for you, not for cattle or crops." Lillian smiled, touched by his constant thoughtfulness. "I'd like that," she agreed. "Though you've already given me everything I could ever want." Blake's arm tightened around her waist. "Not everything," he countered with a grin. "Still working on that larger dining table you mentioned. Can't have the twins squeezed in when they arrive." "Such confidence," Lillian teased. "Doctor." "Mason said it might be twins." "Trust me," Blake said with a wink. "Hawkins' men have a sense about these things." As the afternoon sun bathed their home in golden light, Lillian thought about the long road that had led them here, the losses and gains, the sorrows and joys that had shaped their shared story. From a broken-hearted widow and a wandering cowboy to partners in every sense, their journey had been one of transformation. The promise Blake had made that first day bread on the table, love in the house had been fulfilled beyond measure. What had begun as a business arrangement had blossomed into a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone, living on in their children and the land they had nurtured together. In the end, that was what mattered most, not the cattle or the crops or the expanded homestead, but the family they had created and the love that had made it all possible. A love born in the aftermath of loss, tempered by shared struggle and strengthened by unwavering commitment. As Benjamin and Rebecca's laughter filled the air, as Blake's steady presence anchored her in this moment of perfect contentment, Lillian offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the day a dusty cowboy had knocked on her door and changed her life forever with a simple promise that had meant everything.